Welcome to the Perspective Podcast. Today I'm joined by the usual wonderful Dr. Tim Quinlan, who is a psychotherapist and a mentor for me in life. And today we're going to talk about who are you? So that's the name of today's broadcast.
A big question, which we all need to answer.
And I suppose we'll just go straight in. So I for viewers' disclosure, I have written out in this booklet my questions I'm going to ask Tim. And Tim, you're, unlike me, you're going to have to go off the cuff, so good luck.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll start with, Tim, you sent me a paper on the 7 pathways to self, as you called it, and it goes through a sort of history of different therapies and different therapists, and with the goal, I suppose, of realising who is the actual self. And we'll start off with the school of psychodynamics, which of course starts with Freud, who didn't discover the unconscious, but formally recognised it in analytical psychology. So Freud, of course, popularised the unconscious, and I just wanted to start us off, Tim, by asking you, what is the unconscious?
Okay, well, the unconscious is everything that I really don't know about myself that lies within me. And a big thing to acknowledge is the fact that the unconscious was always at work throughout the history of humanity from the beginning. And Freud popularized the idea of the unconscious. I suppose the best thing to describe this is to describe the unconscious is to say that, say, in literature, in Shakespeare, in poetry, like with Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Byron and all these people, they began listening to their dreams. They began, and so you got, say, Gothic literature, where you had all these monsters and everything. All of these monsters were encountered in their dreams, which were their inspiration. So the unconscious has always been acknowledged in literature. Indeed, it has been acknowledged in religion too. For instance, we know that Jacob had, in the Bible, had dreams at the foot of a ladder, that dreams were always seen as the divine communicating with man. So in a sense, before Freud came along at all, that was this whole area of the unknown mind that was communicating itself to us. So Freud came along, and his idea was he saw in the late 19th century a lot of archaeologists digging up the past and going down. And that gave him the idea of digging down in the human mind. And he says, well, if I dig down to find out about human culture, perhaps if I dig down into the mind, I'll find layers. And he found layers. And the 3 layers he came up with were the conscious mind. That is everything I'm conscious of now, Dylan. For instance, I'm conscious that you're there, and I'm conscious you're wearing lovely glasses and all that. And I'm conscious of the microphone in front of you, and I'm conscious that I'm sitting in this room. So that's conscious. Now, pre-conscious can be described as, you say to me, how did you get here? So now I'm going to have to think, okay, what way did I actually come? I came a very circuitous route today because of the traffic, right? So I'd have to sit down and think of the way I was. So that's there in my pre-conscious. So I have to make a deliberate effort to get to pre-conscious. But the unconscious then is something I just don't know anything about, until I begin, as Freud says, either to start with free association or to start by analysing my dreams, okay? Or going back and seeing what worries me now and why did it worry me. And I start digging into the past, and I dig down, and there are symbols there which are and characters and demons and all types of images that come from the unconscious. I know that was a rather long-winded...
Not at all, Tim. It leads perfectly into the next part of psychodynamics. You mentioned images and themes and the like. So Freud's student, of course, Carl Jung, talks a lot about symbology and the importance of symbols and about archetypes. And within the unconscious, he sort of unpacks how all of these have had historical purpose and context in religion and mythology and everywhere. And he sort of unpacks as well different dimensions of the self. And we get to the shadow. And this reminds me of the id that you had mentioned in the last take of the podcast, of Freud's sort of the animalistic or the base urge,
Mm-hmm.
uh, say, operandi, the way we function. So I suppose I'll just stick with the shadow for now. So Jung had this therapy called shadow work, and I want to ask you, Tim, what is shadow work and how have you implemented it in your therapeutic
Okay,
practice?
shadow work is a huge thing in Jungian therapy. And I suppose the best description of shadow work I ever came across, what is the shadow? They say, I thought this was the simplest definition of it, our emotional blind spot. So my shadow is my emotional blind spot, stuff I'm denying about myself, and I'm pushing it down into the unconscious. And, we push it down, and in pushing it down, we project it onto others, okay? And perhaps I'd say, oh, what is it? For instance, if Trump comes on the television, he annoys me. Why does he drive me mad? Is it saying something about me? Is there something I have about power? Is it something in me that I'm projecting onto him? Perhaps not, perhaps it is. Or for instance, I see my friend Tom is very rigid. Or, uh, for instance, a friend of mine had a dream recently, and that he was in a bookshop, and he met this man who wouldn't change his opinion. And he said, but you must change your opinion. And as we began to work with the dream, we realized that what that was saying to Tom was the actual man in the bookshop was actually his alter ego. It was actually himself. Everything in your dream is about yourself. So what he has to do, and I said to him, this is what you have to do. What in you is so opinionated? What in you is so right that you can't change? So maybe you are the person that's too rigid. So in other words, that's the dream is showing him up his blind spot. His blind spot is my opinions are the opinions. And this particular guy can be very self-righteous, and he can be, demand, oh no, I'm right, you're wrong, So, or if I see Mary is too soft, well, maybe it's me, I'm projecting that softness onto Mary. Or Jim is always angry, but maybe that's my something in me that may be angry. Or Joe is a con man. Why do I think Joe is a con man? Maybe there's something in me that I'm not acknowledging. And so Jung would say we project our shadow onto our environment and onto others. And so, in fact, you mentioned the word cognitive distortion, and that's the where the cognitive distortion comes in, So I think
What
that's...
can I ask you, Tim? Sorry,
Yes.
what is the purpose of the projection? Why can't the unconscious, or why can't the conscious, contend with its own?
I think that is exactly at the heart of it. We are very weak human beings. We are very, very weak. We don't like acknowledging the faults in ourselves. Go back, I would quote the Bible. We see the log in somebody else. Sorry, we see the splinter in someone else's eye, but we don't see the log in our own. And we project onto others because we cannot face the darkness in ourselves. And shadow work means I have to face my shadow self, and that is a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong journey. For instance, another one. Now, there are loads of shadow work questionnaires you can get on the internet, and I've done several of them. And I was just thinking there, here's just a few questions that I got on one of those shadow work questionnaires. Whom do you hate and judge the most? So who do I hate and judge the most? What's that saying about me? What group of people most repulses me or terrifies you? But think of what's the shadow there. At the moment, the Israelis, what shadow has anyone from Israel about Palestinians? What shadow are they projecting, the Palestinians projecting onto the Israelis? What shadow is Putin and his ilk projecting onto the Ukrainians? So we project that. What group of people most repulses is one. There was another one here that said here, and this is an interesting one. What is your family shadow? What is your family shadow? And I had a big family meeting yesterday because we went to a funeral of an aunt who died at 100.5 years of age. Now I know what the family shadow is because I suffer from it myself, which is depression. And that was denied. So there's a family shadow. And as we look at the family, we will go back and we look at what's called a genotype. You will find a lot of people over the years suffered from depression. So in other words, there's a family shadow. I'm now, interestingly enough, sitting at the table yesterday, my first cousin starts talking about another cousin who definitely suffers from bipolar. And we were actually exposing the family shadow. We actually did shadow work at the table. And we said, oh no, but that Paul has that, yes, and I have that, and Uncle Jimmy had that, right? These were all bipolar. So in other words, we are taking the family shadow and owning it. So there's an example of where it would. Another question that had on this one, which I quite liked, whom do you envy? Okay. Who envies you and how do you feel if you are envied? Or another one, which I thought was nice, the family shadow. Who in your family is carrying the anxiety? Who in your family is the carrier of depression? Who in your family is the carrier of addiction? And they're carrying the shadow of the family. So that's what I see. So shadow work. Now, for anyone that's listening, this, as I say to my students at DCU, this is the heavy stuff. It's the heavy lifting. Psychodynamic counselling or psychotherapy is only for those who have a load of money, a load of time to spend looking at their navel, because if you think of it, Freud and Jung, all their clients were rich people who were involved in looking at themselves. So this is a deep therapy. It's a long therapy. It's not the one that I would advise to anyone to follow unless they're really into getting to know themselves in a big way.
Well, if you don't mind me saying, Tim, I wouldn't be someone, say, with a lot of money, but I found psychodynamics very important. Now, that being said, I did have a lot of time on my hands over the summer.
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant.
So I found psychodynamics to, like, just the idea of the unconscious, and naturally it is the one that would be most time consuming because by nature our unconscious is what we don't know about ourselves.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to be the most time consuming the most. But I think particularly on the shadow, like the utility of knowing your own dark side, I don't think I can, just speaking on my own personal experience, I didn't know that I held other people to different standards, say, or prejudged people and all this, Tim, because I think most people don't. We like to think we're not very judgmental and that we're quite good people, and of course you can be, but it's inseparable from us, that dark side, because in some ways it does have a utility, and that's what I guess is, that it's fearful to say, because nobody wants a society where people have anger, say, or frustration, or even assertiveness sometimes can be mischaracterized. I think in today's culture, masculinity, say, you hear wind of toxic masculinity, and in my eyes, that can be used in a good sense as a comment on, say, gender roles where it may apply, but I think it can be misused in that way that the idea of the strong man, we're so scared of that image that we don't want to see that in ourselves, that may be irrational, or that anger, but I found in my personal experience seeing actually where, for lack of a better example, just because it's the exemplar of evil, seeing the Hitler in myself.
Yes.
And the dictator in myself.
Yes.
The one who wants his will on everyone else.
Yes.
and wants his own way.
Yes.
Acknowledging that in myself has been so helpful in just becoming more empathetic, more just aware of my own motivations and my own, things I just wasn't even aware of. So,
what you're saying makes an awful lot of sense. And if I look at those 7 pathways to the self, I will say that I spend an inordinate amount of time working with Freud and Jung on myself. I find them 2 fabulous, enriching sources to work on yourself and the deep self. The others are all more healing therapies that you can use every day. But because if you are a philosophical or a psychological personality like you or me, you will find, and you're into depth psychology, you will be attracted to both of these characters.
And sorry, Tim, but you mentioned earlier about not just let alone the shadow, but something struck me earlier when you're talking about how your family had a consultation with each other about everyone's collective shadow.
Yes.
And we talked earlier in the last broadcast, but the idea of archetypes is something I wanted to bring up from Jung, and of course this stems from the unconscious too. But it's the idea that symbology, symbols, and then personified symbols like archetypes.
Yes.
They hold weight and importance in our orientation in life, the interplay of our thoughts and our connection to others. And I think those projections, often they can be archetypal.
Okay.
I wanted you to talk on that.
Okay. Archetypes are interesting. And again, I was trying to figure out a simple definition. And I just thought of a mould, the original mould or the prototype of a certain character or a universal pattern, right? It's something that's rooted deeply in our collective unconscious. Now, the best way, I was sort of fishing around for a while to come up with something on that. And I was using, Jung differentiates 12 different archetypes. And the first one is the innocent, the archetype of the innocent child, if you like. But interestingly enough, that has been called in traditional literature, has been called the puer aeternus, the eternal youth. Now, if I were to look at a good example of that, I would take Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was this amazingly creative singer and dancer who took the world by storm. But he called his home Neverland. Peter Pan. Peter Pan, if you like, is the complex. He had a Peter Pan complex. So he ended up, his best friends were children. And for instance, I know he went through 3 or 4 court cases on was he a paedophile or not. It is my opinion that none of us can judge, number one. Number two, I think he was captivated or captured by is better, captured by and overtaken by the archetype of the eternal youth. That in other words, this was the archetype, the symbol that meant most to him. And I think if I was to look at him, and if I was in a Jungian sense to offer a diagnosis, I'd say he was a person who had never grown up. All his friends were children, and that the fact that he had children in bed didn't mean that he was attacking them. That maybe he felt he was still a child and he was relating to them. Now that to me is, I think everything about him was caught up in the archetype. The archetype controlled him. The puer aeternus, and that was a blind spot. He didn't see that was that by society would have been seen as unnatural, right? So he didn't see that because he was blinded. So it's a emotional blind spot, and I think uh, that was, in a sense, the shadow work he should have been doing. So there's an example. Now, another archetype would be the archetype of the old man, you know. I mean, by doing the old man who's wise, okay? Someone who's a source of wisdom. And the hero is obviously a very important archetype or symbol for any child. And in fact, if you work with, and I worked in an autism unit, as you well know, I would always try and find out what is the child's hero, or who is the child's hero, because that would give you a key to their personality. Who is their hero? You know, this is an archetype that they're going to follow. And say, for instance, I think the fellows that are involved in music, they always had a person that they really loved, and they actually tried to repeat that. And that symbol of the hero. So archetypes are symbols too. See, each of those are a symbol. You know, Peter Pan, the symbol of Peter Pan, eternal youth. But realistically, I know I'm going to get old and die. So really, being captivated by the puer aeternus is a bit of a lie to ourselves, a lie about reality. So really, if I have to incorporate the puer aeternus, I then accept it and bring it in, and I move on. But when I keep projecting it out, and I must have a whole Disney world in my home, there's where my archetype has taken over.
That's amazing. Oh, I think that's like so relevant for a lot of people, Tim, because I think in a societal sense, as we become more, inundated with consumerism and I guess like an overabundance in society, and I know that'll upset some people because a lot of people have it hard, and personally I think everyone has it hard, but I think nonetheless anyone would be hard pressed to say that overall we have it, harder than 100 years ago.
No,
in a
we don't
societal
really.
sense. So I think that allure and that sort of enabling of that, continual adolescence and resistance to growing up. I think it's very relevant today.
Yeah, and in fact, you're saying the resistance to growing up. There was one boy I was dealing with, and obviously remain nameless, and his big thing was, and he said to me one day, "Sir, I just don't want to grow up, because I know I'm going to have to be responsible. I have people there to look after me now, but if I grow up, I'm going to have to be responsible."
Yeah, I think everyone struggles with that at some point. So I want to delve a bit away from the psychodynamic school of thought now,
Okay.
Tim, and go into the next therapist, who's Alfred Adler, who you actually introduced me to, whose work I love. So his approach is, it takes from the psychodynamic skill, but you had mentioned it's also a humanistic therapy.
Yes.
And Adler's therapy stressed the innate desire of individuals to belong to a group or society as a preventative measure to loneliness and alienation.
Correct.
So what I want to ask you, Tim, I have written here is, in this alienation then, would it be fair to say it's where people are vulnerable to a feeling of inferiority, and if left unchecked, could this develop into an inferiority complex, like you mentioned earlier?
Yes, absolutely, it will. As you can see, the desire to belong, and then if you're outside the group, you're going to be feeling inferior, obviously. So they are two linked concepts. I suppose the first thing that strikes me, I think a good psychotherapist, first of all, has worked on him or herself more than the client, because you can't be projecting your needs onto the client, obviously. So I have to start with myself, and I would say, okay, I have to look at my own inferiority and what does it feel to be outside the group. I remember when I was in first year secondary school, how awful it felt to be outside the group, to be on the outside. I went only twice out to the sports field, and I was no good at team sports. And anyway, I was wearing glasses, so I was pretty much so standing on the sideline watching the guys. So I was one of these guys who was never picked to play football. So you feel different, you feel inferior, and you always saw that the guys who were physically fit got all the plaudits, right? So to feel outside the group is not a good feeling. And then when I went teaching, actually, strangely enough, when I went to college, I felt a little bit more and part of the group because this guy said to me, I went to Mater Dei where there weren't that many men. There were a lot of girls in a teacher training college for English and religion, right? And he said, we need someone for the team. But I said, I've never played football. He said, it doesn't matter, you can come along and train, right? So that at least gave me a feeling of inclusion, right? So there's a feeling of inclusion there. So I would say then I went to school, and when I was teaching, one of the things I say to the students I teach is, watch for the loner child. Watch for the child who feels not part of a group. Can you set up some activities that every child feels part of the group, right? So you want them to belong. And again, bear in mind what you're saying, that if the child does not feel they belong, they're obviously feeling inferior too. And they can have an inferior complex. So in fact, I think Adler is very, very good on that area, because he would want to see an inferiority complex as a drive to better yourself rather than giving up.
Do you mind me asking, Tim, if you could recount from your personal, clinical and sort of experience as a guide, say, in whether it's in education or psychotherapy, of course, what if anyone came to you, say, people feeling alienated and looking to you for guidance or advice, was there like what was a recurring, say, what was a recurring sort of theme, or what often would be the cause of alienation with them, and
Yeah, I think now that's a big question. It can be early rejection. It can be early, for instance, now attachment theory is a very, very important theory in psychotherapy. And a psychiatrist called John Bowlby spoke an awful lot about attachment. And that will itself influence alienation, if you like. If the child is if, for instance, they say that if in the first 6 months the mother-child attachment is not very strong, the child will then feel completely alienated. And I think you have to have attachment to family. Does the child belong to the family? Has the child a feeling of belonging? And I think early on you will find, or for instance, absent father is another thing, or a not so strong father and an overpowering mother. So to look at attachments and how those attachments are, I would think that some of it stems from lack of proper attachment to significant adults in their lives, mother or father, and then other significant adults as they meet them along the way. Now, you see, your question is a very deep one. What would I say? These kids feel alienated. These kids don't belong. And what you have to say, well, you try to get them to, I suppose a thing I would do there is, I think to belong, you have to belong to yourself. I know this sounds a bit stupid, or a bit strange. Can you belong to yourself? Can you, are you at home in your own mind? Can I pull up the chair beside the roaring fire of my own mind, right, and sit down there and feel comfortable in my own mind? Do I belong in here? So I think it's something about belonging to yourself, and I think a therapist can help the person accept themselves and belong and feel at home in themselves, and then perhaps feel that they can belong anywhere.
But of course, the emphasis of today's broadcast is on what is in your locus of control, which is yourself.
Yourself,
ultimately.
yes.
But I think it's nevertheless interesting. I think us being social animals, there's a definite correlation between your psychic and your mental health and your feeling of a greater community
Yeah.
and part of something. And interestingly, there, Tim, you mentioned about it brought me back to, we had a broadcast on autism and Kanner's theory on the refrigerator mother
Yes.
being an environmental cause maybe of autism or autistic like symptoms in childhood development. And I also was brought to a lecture I attended with you in DCU, and you had a fellow scholar, Andrew,
Andrew, yes.
did a lecture, and you both did it on human development. And I remember him talking about adolescents who were, say, predisposed to criminality.
Yes.
And he used this phrase, differential association. And you brought up as well single motherhood or lack of a father.
Mm-hmm.
And it brought me sort of more broadly than merely clinical, but sociological. I remember reading the work of Charles Murray's The Bell Curve, and in assessing different economic strata in American society. The book's slightly dated now, but I think nevertheless it applies. There was a definite correlation between criminality and fatherlessness
Right.
in lower socioeconomic communities, and also lower socioeconomic community was almost a consistent factor in being grown up in a lower socioeconomic community was the lack of a father.
Yes, correct.
And then, which led into then more likelihood, obviously, of criminality, because if you're from a deprived background, you're more likely to act out, and
Absolutely.
you feel alienated from
Absolutely.
society because you're at the
Absolutely.
bottom.
Yes.
So I just found that interesting. But I might digress, Tim.
Okay, no, that's fine. Because what we're talking about is, I think another thing about Adler is that he began the movement away from medicalized psychotherapy. He began the movement into more counseling and client. So you got counselor and client beginning to come in with Adler, which was taken up later by Carl Rogers. But Adler had a great understanding. He was a very caring man. He set up loads of clinics for children, and he wanted adults to really nurture and nourish children into the fullness of their selfhood. So, in fact, he was a very compassionate man, and he wanted everyone to belong and to feel cared for. So, caring is another part of his. And I think you are right. I know one of the things that you would be doing with a client, if you're doing that Adlerian psychotherapy, is to make sure that they're feeling that they belong, that they belong to their family, that they belong to their community. And that whole sense of belongingness has to be worked on.
So I suppose in moving on from Adler, Tim, we then had Laura Perls and Fritz Perls, the couple who discovered the Gestalt therapy.
Gestalt, yeah.
Gestalt. I'm assuming they're German or
Yes,
Germanic.
yes, it's Germanic.
Right. So I got from your account, Tim, I'm reading it again, that this goal of therapy is a fear that it's about connecting the mind and body to the present needs of both through awareness.
Yes. And in fact, yes, you summed it up nicely there. It's basically, I suppose, if you think about it, first of all, Gestalt therapy is humanistic in the broadest sense. It relies on drama, it relies on music. It not so much relies on, but it can use all of music and drama and literature to explore the personality. And not alone does it explore the personality, but it explores the connection or the link, and you're right, you got it right, between the body and the mind.
Mm.
As somebody said, which is a nice one, talking about the soul is the same as mind, in my opinion, except soul is a bit deeper than the mind, but we won't go into that. That's a philosophical question. But they talk about the ensouled body and the embodied soul. That, in other words, I can't describe them as two separate entities, because the soul is, or the mind is embodied in the body, but the soul is ensouled in the body. So, and that there's a deep connection between the body and the mind. And one thing that struck me once when I was at a seminar on meditation, the person giving the seminar said the following, and I thought it was lovely. He says, your body is always in the present, but your mind is either in the past or the future. And I thought it was lovely. Your body is always in the present, but your mind is either in the past. You're full of regrets. You're full of ideas about the old world and how shiny it was and how brilliant it was and how utopian it was. It was fabulous. Or you're full of regrets that you never said X or Y to your dad before he died, or your mum before she died. Or you're so anxious about the future, whether it be the future of the planet, whether it be your own personal future. And most psychologists, and certainly the Gestaltists, would say the important thing is to come into the now. And when you come into the now, you come into your body. Okay, so bodily awareness and the connection and contemplation, strangely enough, somebody say, in fact, a friend of mine says, oh, mindfulness is is a total misnomer. It's mindlessness. When I go to meditate, I must get rid of my mind. In other words, all the distractions. I want to sit down there, and what do you do in meditation? You concentrate on your breathing, right? You're going to your breath. And the thing is, the meditators say, and the great gurus say, return to your breath, return to your body. If someone's having a panic attack, most important thing is to get them to stop breathing quickly. Breathe nice and slowly, nice and slowly. Come into the now of your body. And so the Gestaltists then would see the importance of the body. Now, for instance, can I give you an example? So say if you came in and you said to me, I have a creak in my neck, right? And I'd say to you, as a Gestalt therapist, I'd say to you, what would the creak in your neck say to you if the creak in your neck could speak? Or another thing to say you came in and your knee is hopping up and down. And you'd say, I notice your knee, you're moving it up and down nervously. If your knee could talk, what would your knee say now? Now, but that's Gestalt therapy completely, because it's now asking the body to speak.
And I know we've talked about it before, Tim, but if you don't mind me asking, I just think it's a brilliant practical example of this kind of therapeutic approach. Back in secondary school, you know what I'm going to say.
Go on.
But in working with the autistic adolescents,
yes,
an exercise you did in bringing them back to their bodies. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, actually, this was taught to me by an occupational therapist. I feel of all the therapists, the occupational therapists are some of the best, because they are sort of so practical that they embody what all the psychologists are on about theoretically. I don't really mean, it really puts the psychologists in their place, but that's just me now at this moment. Okay, I suppose I learnt about the importance of the body and the importance of stimuli and the importance of multisensory rooms from an occupational therapist. And this occupational therapist came into the school and said, I'm going to do an analysis of, I'm going to do a checkup of, I think there were about 12. We had 2 units rather than 3 units. We had 12 boys. And he says, I'm going to work with each of the 12. And I'm going to ask you, to help me. And which I did. And I learned a lot from him. And one of the things I learned from him was how important accessing your own body and being aware of your own body is to an autistic client. So anyway, he started, we got to the top corridor, and he put a tape, white tape, sticky tape, and he stuck it on the middle of the floor, and he said, I'm going to get each of the boys to run along the white tape, and I'm going to watch how far they move from the vertical perpendicular, right? And he said, now he says, you will notice that the most autistic will have the least balance. And we went through, and there were 8, as I said, there were 12 boys, I think, 6 per unit. And we looked at each of them, and lo and behold, the one that swayed most was the guy that was most autistic. So anyway, then we went and did other things like gross motor skills, fine motor skills. For instance, gross motor skills would be where they'd be able to catch a very big ball like a basketball. So I used to then, as a result, keep a basketball, a soccer ball, and a tennis ball, because when you get down to the tennis ball, you'd be more fine motor skills. And most of the boys couldn't take the thing. But the big thing, I know the one you're going to mention, is the rolling. Now, the rolling is an interesting one for autistic children. And again, we're going back to the Gestalt thing. The Gestalt thing, as I said, is the connection between the body and the mind. One boy who was very, very disruptive in class and very much disruptive of himself, really, and very ill at ease and agitated. Well, if he rolled for a half an hour, he'd probably pick an hour to roll, but he'd get up and he would be a changed person. Okay, now we won't name him by name because I know you know who that was. And I remember you saying to me, sir, I'm not that bad, I don't need to roll. I said, that's fine now, Dylan, you don't need to roll.
In retrospect, I could have done with the rolling.
Okay, now the big thing, and then another man, but see, I learned all this from experience. Another man and his son was the most autistic we ever had. Now, he said to me, I get home, I shouldn't have mentioned the name, it doesn't matter anyway, probably won't be listening to this, nobody will be able to identify him, but you can cut out the name. He says, my son, well, let's call him James, and his name wasn't James. He says, James will calm down when I give him a bear hug. Now, that to me was very significant, because now James has an idea of where his body begins and ends. He actually has an idea of himself. And they've a lovely phrase for it. And I thought this was excellent. The lovely phrase that they use in the autistic literature, or literature talking about autism. Mind you, maybe a lot of the people who write the literature are autistic. I don't know. But anyway, a lovely phrase they have, and I love it because I like Latin, is proprioception, which means, now proprio is the Latin for self.
Very relevant.
So very relevant. So proprioception, my actual sense of myself. And strangely enough, if you look at the science, I went to the biology teacher, Mr. Sheehan, and I said, have you ever heard of proprioceptors? He says, of course I have. He says, we have them all in our bodies because a proprioceptor in my finger is telling me that my finger is at that bottle.
Yeah.
Right. So it's given me the sense of myself. And it has been found that people with autism have less proprioceptors in their nervous system than the neurotypical.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So now we're going to move on to Carl Rogers, which is a name I've heard a lot from lectures by the psychologist Jordan Peterson, who I mention every broadcast, who is again from the humanist school, I believe.
Yes.
And his therapeutic approach, I'm reading here, is called person-centered therapy, in which he placed a crucial importance on the journey of a person's life. What going back to Jung might have called the individuation process.
Yes, which we didn't mention, but I mean, that's the very same.
So, Tim, could you tell us about Carl Rogers and about the discovery process that experience brings in shaping a person, if that's not too vague for you?
Okay, all right. Carl Rogers continued. He wasn't really, definitely wasn't a Freudian, and he certainly would have known of Adler, but continued Adler's democratization of therapy. So initially, as I said, with all the other ones, it was the medicalized version, it was the doctor or psychiatrist and patient. With Carl Rogers, it definitely becomes the counsellor and the client, and they can have a contract between them. He saw therapy as now being something that can be owned by the masses. That, in other words, if somebody goes into any job now, they will be told that there's an EAP there. That is an employee assistance program. That, in other words, in most places of work, including teaching, you're entitled to 6 free counselling sessions if you feel you're under pressure. And I suppose also he felt that the most important thing in anybody's life was not the knowledge they had, while that did or was important, but it was also their experience. So he wanted to listen to, and listening was a big thing for him, to listen to the experience of people. The experience of people in real life. And that was his, and he was also one of the first psychotherapists to embrace modern technology. For instance, in the 50s, he began recording sessions. Now, he would have done that with his client's permission. And he would say, I want to record this session so that I will have scientific data as to how the counselling situation actually works. And in fact, we still have, you can get it on YouTube, you can get videos of Carl Rogers in counselling sessions with clients, and it'll show you his, and from all of these videos, he came up with what person-centered therapy was. Person-centered therapy is, he had a few catchphrases. One was, the client knows best. The client knows best, okay? And that was a big phrase that he used quite often, and you'll hear that when they talk about person-centered therapy. The client knows best. Another thing he pushed was, it's the relationship that heals. So psychotherapy means the healing of the mind. So the relationship that the client would have with the counsellor counted, because he said it's that relationship that heals. And if the client doesn't feel comfortable with the counsellor, there's going to be no therapy, no counselling there at all, because the client is feeling so uncomfortable that this relationship cannot heal the client. So he said it's the relationship that heals. The client knows best. And another thing, of course, was it's also called non-directive counselling. Carl Rogers didn't believe in prescribing any sort of thing for the patient to follow. He didn't give them exercises. He didn't give them, oh, this is what's wrong with you, go and do X. So he was not prescriptive at all. So he let the client lead it in many ways. Now, he'd prompt it and all of that, obviously. So he respected the client. And he said, I suppose you'll probably want to ask a few more questions, but rather than me going on a bit more, do you want to ask another question on that, or do you want? I've some more bits to say on them. All right.
Yeah, I suppose if you've a bit more to say on them, Tim, then I might bring up the fact that in my own experience in therapy, I find my counsellor at the moment is very good, because he has a similar approach to Carl Rogers, in that it's all about letting me come to my own kind of conclusions.
Yes.
And sometimes that can be frustrating when you want to know the answers.
Correct.
Because I think it can be hard to
yeah.
come to a conclusion yourself. Sometimes you just want someone to tell you.
Yeah, and they won't tell you. No, in counselling we never do.
But of course, it only makes the answer more rewarding then.
Yes.
When it derives from your
Absolutely.
own, I guess, conclusion. But with Carl Rogers there, it was something interesting you said how it sort of reminds me of that Freudian idea of free association with the client, of letting them come to their own.
Yes.
So, like, I suppose, you mentioned about this helped with democratizing psychotherapy. And would then the emphasis be less on medicalizing? So
absolutely, the emphasis would be way less on medicalizing. The last thing you would do is to medicalize it in counselling, And in fact, if someone is so agitated, and they would normally not be coming to a counsellor in that condition, but if they were, the counsellor would probably insist that they'd go to their own doctor, you know, because they'd be intuiting that this person has some sort of a medical condition. And in fact, one of the things that in a lot of therapy, they ask the client about that. Are they on any antidepressants? Are they attending a doctor? Are they attending a psychiatrist? They'd have to know that. So they would find that out. But the last thing a counsellor would go into is to unless the client was so agitated that they said, well, you must go back and see your doctor, or you must go back and see your psychiatrist. But certainly no, medicalising would be the last thing they would want to do. And if anything, they would try and get people, if people were over-reliant on antidepressants for endogenous reasons, that non-medical reasons, say, but ones that are shaped by stresses from their job, they would try and get them off. Say, well, no, go to your doctor and say, really, do you need that? You know, they might, but if there's so they wouldn't be outright against medicalising. They would refer on to a psychiatrist if they felt the patient was very agitated. But in general, there would be nothing to do with very seldom would any medical stuff come up.
I think that's important, because I feel like nowadays there's like a two-sided phenomenon now of with everything becoming medicalised, while at the same time stigma decreasing about disorders, mental health, everything. So on one hand, it's a positive that there's no more stigma anymore to having an anxiety disorder, depression.
Correct.
Or, you know, nowadays I find a lot more people identifying as ADHD, and now there's this term neurodivergent, which includes a host of sort of neurological disorders. But I wonder, sort of in medicalising it, does it take away in a sense? Because we talked there about how we all want answers to our own troubles, and sometimes we just want to hear someone tell us what the answer is. And I think sometimes it can be a kind of weak substitute for an explanation. In other times it can explain something you needed to know, like, I'm autistic, this means I have this difficulty. But in other ways it can limit, and it can almost take away from the experiences you may have, because if you just peg it to depression, to autism, to whatever it is, it almost takes away that individual experience that, you know, as soon as we kind of call it a medical label and that's it, and you need to now take this medication or you need to undergo this, it kind of takes away from the individual, I feel.
Well, it does.
And that's something I liked about your interventions, Tim, in secondary school in the autism unit, because it wasn't you have autism, it was you have autism and your name is, and you like, and this is your strength as well as your weakness, you know.
Yeah. I think to over-medicalise is crazy. And in fact, that happens due to ignorance too. And we have very sad things that have happened in Ireland, like the over-medicalising of autistic children in the CAMS unit in Kerry. That was a horrific scandal of late, where these kids were put on psychotropic drugs and psychoactive drugs, and it affected their personalities. And these cases are going through the courts. And then they found out that the doctor that had prescribed them wasn't a fully qualified psychiatrist. So in fact, and there was nobody, so to over-medicalise, to make up for the ignorance, where in fact counselling could help. So I certainly think, and we have seen that, as I said, in the present court cases that are happening, obviously to over-medicalise anything is bad. Medical intervention should only be made when it is required, when the person is so agitated that no psychotherapeutic or psychological intervention will help. That's the only time, and that should be called by a fully qualified psychiatrist. Um,
So then, Tim, I suppose if we can move on to the
yes,
next therapy, which is, I'd say, the most known therapy, which is CBT,
yes,
cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'm sure many of the viewers that would be the most recognizable therapy, because it's ultra practical, and it's out of all the therapies that the results can be over time, where CBT is very you kind of see results very quick
yes,
by applying it, if you apply it right. So I guess I had this kind of interlocking the previous what we talked about in the person-centered therapy, Tim.
yes,
So after fostering the self-knowledge and self-esteem, which I think is fair to say the purpose of the previous therapies,
yes,
cognitive behavioral therapy then is focused on changing harmful thought patterns and behavioral patterns that work to distort our ownership of ourselves. Would that be a fair assessment?
that would be a very good assessment. Yeah, I'm just thinking of a song by Meatloaf. You took the words right out of my mouth. I don't know if you ever heard that song.
No.
Okay. Anyway, yes, okay. Indeed, it would be a very fair summary of CBT. CBT can be used, and very much so, in teaching, and especially in teaching special ed. I the and do interrupt me if I'm not answering your question fully. Okay, I'd like to start with a very simple image to sum up CBT, because from my experience as a teacher. And okay, CBT works, say, when there's anxiety. And anyone who knows anything about autism knows that the number one thing in autism is the high levels of anxiety. And I always had in my classroom a thermometer, and if I had 2 or 3 autistic kids, I'd always get them to tell me their temperature that day. I mean, in other words, how high on would their anxiety be, to see where exactly on this thing would their anxiety be. Now, while I was training as a special ed teacher, I used the practical CBT approach. I had one young lad who had a problem doing his maths homework. And his problem was that he needed, his mother was saying, oh God, he could spend 3 hours on his maths, okay? Because he was so anxious, he wanted to work it out. And what you'd want to do is then specify how long he was to stay at it. Okay, so you can, how am I going to change the child's anxiety? Well, his thoughts are, I must get this finished. I'm useless if I don't get this finished, right? Okay, well, right. To use a CBT intervention would be, I had little stickers called traffic lights. Now, so what you would do with the kid that had anxiety over doing maths questions. So he's going to get 3 maths questions from me as a maths teacher. And I'm going to put beside each question a little traffic lights. Now, before he reads the question, and if he can do it, he strokes green. So he goes off and does it. The next thing is, now it's the orange one, that's the important one. The orange one is, I think I can do it, and I'm going to spend, now you have to work this out with the SNA and with the boy, or the girl, depends me. Orange means I spend 15 minutes on the question max. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, if he strokes red or she strokes red, you don't touch it. Now, that gives them control over the maths question before they even start the maths question.
And in turn, the anxiety.
And the anxiety comes down. Because what I've done now, I've changed the thought pattern. The thought pattern, I'm useless at maths, I'm not going, but I really want to get this finished. And my anxieties keep me there, and I still want to do it. But I haven't taken control of the anxiety. I take control of the thought processes through the symbols. And I got one very good teacher. He was in our unit. I'm trying to think of his name. It's on the tip of my tongue. But he used to have a traffic lights under every boy's desk.
I remember him, or was it before my time?
No, you should know him there. A small man, low-sized man. He was from Kilkenny. Anyway,
Oh, I know who you're talking
yeah,
about.
but he was lovely. He had a great. So that was CBT practically. Now another thing would be what's called exposure therapy. Now exposure therapy, I used once or twice, but you'd need a whole staff to help you. For instance, say if guy is afraid to get the bus, so you train him how to get the bus, and what you would have to do is sit down and make out a plan, and the plan would be, well, I myself and the SNA will accompany him to the bus stop. We'll get the bus with him, and then maybe the next part of it is we accompany him home, and then the teacher withdraws, and then the SNA goes, then the SNA withdraws. Or, for instance, you'd work this out. Maybe you sit 3 seats behind him, or maybe you sit downstairs, he goes upstairs, and then eventually what you're trying to do by your exposure therapy is that eventually he'll be able to get into the bus on his own, right? And so what you're gradually doing is exposing him to the stimulus, but not throwing him in by immersion.
I want to plug Tim, because we're going to have our next guest of the podcast, who we're excited to speak to, is going to be Emma Vincent, who's the regional manager of Gael Autism Services.
Right.
And the reason I want to bring him up is because some people may be thinking, who view this, hopefully there's many, especially educators, will think our school doesn't allow the funding, or there's, schools have certain issues around bringing pupils out and whatever.
Yes.
But I just wanted to say with Gael, they have very much that kind of, I know that they've done a lot of exposure therapy, and I assume they know it, but even if unintentionally, they help. So instead of an SNA, say, if you're a client in Gael, you're given a caseworker.
Right.
And this person is assigned to you, and you'll see them every week. I see my caseworker on a once-a-week basis.
Right.
And you'll have something to work on usually.
Yes.
And it could be, like, I know that's a big one, is like being anxious around grocery shopping,
Yes.
getting the bus. And what these caseworkers will often do is just what you said, Tim, what you did in Joey's, which is exposure therapy, having someone there to sort of control the situation but push the envelope slightly each time.
Yes,
but
each
only
time,
slightly,
but only slightly, and that's the
gradually.
big thing. Now another one we did in Joey's was we found with two of them was queuing in a shop. We had to train a guy how to queue and how to ask for. Again, you do it in steps. You might even go in and say to the shopkeeper, I have this, blah, or whatever. Or you're bringing him over to the local restaurant for a cup of coffee. We used to do that, and I'd say to the barista, I'm coming in with one of the boys. I want him to order, you know what I mean? So you'd actually do it in steps, yeah. But it takes time because you have to build up the steps. And if you are aware of CBT, it has to be gradual and continual. So you'll be doing that over a period of weeks. Now, here is where the problem lies. If somebody in charge of the in charge says, "Oh, I want that boy in class all the time," but they have to be. You have to have realistic, flexible school structures.
Yeah.
That's what I found, and sometimes school structures are not terribly flexible enough. Either because the department isn't given enough resources, you know what I mean, and that the teachers haven't time to do this, but you need time to build all of those things up.
I think I feel really lucky to live in a time where like groups I'm part of, whether it's Not So Different or Gael Autism Services, and even sort of less so now, but the Irish Guide Dogs, like there is, in my experience, so much support. And I think a lot of it is not known it's out there. But I do notice more and more a sort of, as I get older, funny enough, in being through services as an adolescent, I didn't very much feel control. My anxiety, the tool I was given for it was purely medical intervention, medications, and then in the worst cases, given wrong, behavioural interventions which were borderline abusive. But nowadays I feel very happy that as an adult I notice CBT in a lot of the services I'm part of now, whether it's Gale or are not so different, which isn't so much a therapy or it's more a work a workshop place to work on career and employment. But nevertheless, the sort of ethos
Yes.
thing, I just find as an adult anyway, and not to harper on about the autism point, but therapies and services are a lot better as an adult for some reason. I think it's because it takes into that autonomy and ownership, and I wish that was kind of introduced a bit younger.
Well, the problem is a general one in mental health. Our mental health services right across the board for anyone between the ages of 12 and 18 are crap, right? And we have to admit that. 18 upwards, they know what to do with them, right? We have the services there, but the services are notoriously absent for the young age group, and that is a tragedy. But I know even this morning they were talking on the radio of how they wanted to push more money into the mental health of our young people, but they'll get there. I think we'll get there eventually.
Of course, it's harder too, because with young people, you're obviously, if I'm an adult going to a service, I'm doing it of my own volition. Whereas it's harder to affect the child's life because they're not in.
And if you say, will you go over and see the counsellor, the child probably won't go over there, and they should physically bring them over, and then you can't force a person to go to counsel. You're right. So, like, I mean, there's a whole question of autonomy there.
So I hope this is a smooth enough transition, Tim. But in all the therapies we talked about, the final branch was existential psychotherapy.
Correct.
And this is one we've talked about before. And to me, it's sort of, I'm reading, the grittiest and least conceptual of all the therapies, because it deals with maybe the realist reality that's the prevalence of suffering.
Yes.
Which me and you talk a lot about. And it's probably the hardest to tackle philosophically, because it's so, for lack of a better word, gritty. And I think the other therapies give a great tool set to delve into the more grittier psychotherapy, and that's why I like how in your paper on the 7 pathways to self, Tim, I like how you brought existential psychotherapy last, because it's almost like the toolkit building self-esteem, self-knowledge, and then self-control.
Yes.
Add. It sort of prepares you then to take on the biggest challenge, which is my mortality.
Correct. And in fact, just on a link there, and I know it's a link you'd appreciate because you spoke about Epictetus in one of our talks, probably when we're talking about suffering, and a link between CBT now and existential therapy. There is a link, and the link is that we may not have the freedom to deny suffering and to deny suffering that's inflicted on us by others, but we do have the freedom to choose our attitude to it. And this leads us into the existential. Now, Epictetus and those would say that we must, if something goes wrong, it's my attitude to it that is the big thing. And if I can create a positive attitude, I'm so much better. The big thing about existential, and the existentialists took their cue from the phenomenologists. And phenomenology was where you took the real person in the real situation. How does the real person feel in the real situation? And that meant to take in suffering. And Rollo May was the biggest influencer in America in existential therapy. He wrote his doctoral thesis on anxiety because he felt this was the modern disease that everybody suffered from. Anxiety. You'd probably put loneliness in there as well, but anxiety was the big thing he saw. And this is the existential basis of existentialism, comes from from Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian and philosopher, who talked about the anxiety, or what he called angst of life, that, or as you said, facing our own mortality. And the existentialists emerged during the Second World War and after it. And you can see why. Because Europe was completely decimated. People were anxious. People were suffering. Of course they were suffering. Everything around them, there was rationing. People were, and the amount of people who had lost limbs was huge. Like there was huge existential suffering. And so out of this existentialism emerged the existential therapy. And Rollo May took this into America, and he influenced Aaron Yalom, who wrote the quintessential book called Existential Psychotherapy, and it's a brilliant book. And in it he says that every anxiety a modern man has is, if you like, a substitute for the deepest anxiety we all face, namely our own extinction. So no matter what anxiety, he said, that people suffer from, agoraphobia, claustrophobia, or whatever the phobias or anxieties they suffer from, that at the base of it was the fact that, he said, the real anxiety is death anxiety. So he saw that, and meaninglessness was another one he saw. He saw now freedom as one of the anxieties. And this was where, now that sounds strange, but it's not actually. What it really means is the real freedom requires responsibility. And it was the battle between my freedom, but owning my freedom because I'm responsible for my choices. So that meant I have to be responsible. Who's responsible for all that, what's happening in Israel or in Palestine? Maybe it is the corruption in the world. Maybe it is the fact that America and the neo liberal approach to money at all costs. And the reason we support the Jews is because they're the richest group within our country. You know, that it's a neoliberal agenda that we have in the West, and this is causing suffering. So it's a very deep therapy, because it faces issues head on. So you might say you might be dealing with somebody that's dying of cancer, or someone who's suffering whatever stage of cancer, or whatever. So existential therapy is a very, very, very deep therapy. It takes suffering seriously, and it takes the meaning of suffering seriously. And can you see some meaning in suffering? And obviously then I went in after Yalom, I spoke about Viktor Frankl, who again, you could say, based a lot of his theory on Epictetus and all of these ancient school of Stoic school.
And of course, Viktor Frankl himself was a Jew and a survivor of the Holocaust
himself
in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and he had been in 4 different camps. And he said, it's the attitude I take to my suffering. They can't take that freedom away from me. The freedom I take to acknowledge and accept my suffering. They can't take that away from me. I can take a decision.
So I suppose this is irrespective of current events, but something I've been, as you know, Tim, I've been starting to study anthropology, in particular the biblical stories.
Yes.
And something I came across from a lecture by Peterson, who I quote a lot, is the meaning of the word Israel, which is those who wrestle with God.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and in reading the Bible, it makes so much sense, because the formation of Israel and in the formation of and uniting after the fractioning of all the different tribes, the Levites and the Hittites and all the different tribes of Israel, it's like something I admire about actually Israel, and I suppose Jewish identity in a strange way is there's a definite sense of uh, let's say the state of Israel. There's a real sense of resilience and like honing of identity, and I think in that face, in existential war, say, and not to take a side or anything, like the Palestinians, of course, are just as much in belief of their cultural values and their religious values and their society, and there's an admiration I have for both sides of that, strangely, that I think is severely lacking, like you alluded to, Tim, in the West. Like there's we brought up existentialism, and the sort of go-to for me is Nietzsche, who said, of course, God is dead. And in reading Jung, something I found an interesting take in his books, particularly The Undiscovered Self and Dreams and Man in the Symbols. He constantly talks about the current crisis of meaning in modernity in the West, and there's definitely a correlation for him in losing our gods, metaphorically, but also psychologically,
Yes.
I would say. And I
Yes.
think people underestimate the psychological utility of spirituality, religion, belief systems, because we are so consumed by materialistic and rationalistic scientific model of reality now that it's almost we don't even consider. But and I think that's what Jung's theory, like the modern European, is so disconnected from the unconscious as well,
Completely.
for that reason.
Yeah.
And I think I think I don't want to make this a religious broadcast and saying you have to have a God, but one thing I like, I'm not sure who said it, I think it might have been Jung, but it was basically everyone has a God, what's yours? And to some people it's their addiction, it's their infatuation with maybe their partner, it's a alcohol, it's a drug, it's their country. I am a German. It's I'm a follower of Hitler. I'm a follower of Stalin. I'm a follower of Vladimir Putin. I'm an Israeli. I'm a, like, just name it. Like, the idea is that everyone has an underlying motivation, and in the past that was God, and it's like as a collective we don't know what to replace that with.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you talk there, Tim.
Okay, no, I think we're coming near the end. I'm trying to figure out a way of bringing our discussion to some sort of conclusion. I think all of these, I think I'd like to finish with the image of the mountain. Obviously, mountains and valleys, we can't dwell on the top of the mountain all the time. But if we look on the mountain and going up the mountain or going on a journey as the symbol of the spiritual journey, and I would like to feel that the self or God or gods dwell at the top of the mountain. And I said there's 7 paths to self. And I think there are 7 paths up to God or up to self. And Jung got into trouble with the theologians because they got very skeptical of Jung, because they said, for Jung, the self is the God. But we won't go into that. That's a theological and philosophical debate. But the big thing is, I'm just using the image of the hill. There are so many ways up to integrate the self or to individualize or to become self-actualized. And that what we've been discussing today are 7 paths, right? And it's up to each individual to follow their own path up. And each of these paths, we might go from one to the other, and it might help us. I think that's a sort of a sort of symbolic summary of what I was at.
Definitely, Tim. So it's sort of like God can be what moves you,
Yes.
in a sense, towards your whatever value system
that you have.
Yeah. And I think for most people that would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs, belonging, love, you know, yeah, I think they're the main ones.
They are the
Belonging
main
and
one.
love.
Yeah, they are.
It's just striving to be the best version of yourself, I guess.
Yeah,
which is a bit of a cliche, but
that's it.
right. Tim, thanks a million for your time, and I'd like to thank our videographer, Cahill.
Indeed, yes.
And you can follow us at Share Your Perspective. You can look us up on any search engine, and you'll find our channel. Thanks a million.